My name is Madison Rivers and I'm 18 years old. What should have been the happiest day of my life turned into the moment everything I believed about my family shattered into a million pieces. Standing in our living room surrounded by birthday decorations and cake crumbs, my dad looked me dead in the eye and called me another man's mistake before storming out. But here's the thing that still gives me chills: there was a man waiting outside our house that entire time, and when I finally met him, my world flipped upside down forever. Before we dive into this wild family drama that literally changed my entire life, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you're ready for some serious family revenge vibes, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what happens next. It gets absolutely insane. Let me back up and paint you the full picture of that birthday disaster. I'd been planning this party for months, nothing huge, just family and a few close friends. My mom, Patricia, had been acting weird all week, constantly checking her phone and jumping whenever it rang. My dad, Robert, who I'd called dad my entire life, seemed more distant than usual, which was saying something since he'd never been the warm and fuzzy type. The party started normally enough. My best friend Sarah was there, along with my cousins and my mom's sister, Aunt Linda. Everyone was laughing, taking pictures, and I was genuinely having a great time. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt, finally being 18, having my whole family together, feeling like I was ready to take on the world. Then came time for the big reveal. See, I'd been accepted to Stanford with a partial scholarship, and I was planning to announce it during the cake cutting. I was so proud, so excited to share this news with everyone who mattered to me. I stood up, clinked my glass to get everyone's attention, and started my little speech. I have some amazing news to share with all of you. I began, practically glowing with excitement. I got into Stanford and they're offering me a scholarship that covers 60% of my tuition. The reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of cheers and congratulations, there was this weird silence. My mom's face went completely white and she kept glancing toward the front door like she was expecting someone. My dad's expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "That's wonderful, honey," my mom said, but her voice sounded hollow, forced. "We're so proud of you." But my dad just sat there staring at me with this look that made my stomach drop. Finally, he stood up slowly and I could see his hands were shaking, whether from anger or something else, I couldn't tell. "Proud," he said, his voice getting louder. "Proud of what exactly?" "Of raising another man's child for 18 years, of paying for everything while her real father gets to play the hero from a distance." The room went dead silent. My Aunt Linda gasped audibly. Sarah grabbed my arm, probably more confused than I was. But my mom looked like she was going to be sick. "Robert, please," she whispered. "Not like this. Not today." But he was just getting started. 18 years of resentment came pouring out like a dam had burst. He told me how he'd found out I wasn't his biological daughter when I was 5 years old through some medical records during a routine checkup. How my mom had begged him to stay, promised it was just one mistake one night that meant nothing. "I stayed because I thought I could get past it," he continued, pacing around our living room while our guests sat frozen in shock. "I thought I could love you like my own. But every time I look at you, Madison, all I see is her betrayal. All I see is another man's mistake, walking around my house, eating my food, taking my money." I felt like I was going to throw up. These weren't just words, they were like physical blows, each one hitting harder than the last. This man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, and walked me to school on my first day, he saw me as nothing but a reminder of my mother's infidelity. "And now you want to go to Stanford," he laughed, but it was bitter and cruel. "With what money? You think I'm going to pay for another man's child to get an education while he gets all the credit?" That's when my mom finally found her voice. "Robert, stop it, she doesn't deserve this. None of this is her fault." "No," he said, turning to face her. "It's your fault. But I'm done pretending. I'm done playing house with a family that was never really mine." He stormed toward the front door, and that's when he delivered the final blow. "Your real father has been sending money for your college fund for years, Madison. Ask your mother about the checks she's been hiding. Ask her about the man who's been waiting outside our house for the past hour, hoping to finally meet his daughter." And then, he was gone. Just like that. 18 years of my life, and he walked out the door like I meant nothing to him. The silence that followed was deafening. Our guests didn't know where to look or what to say. My birthday cake sat untouched on the table, the candles having burned down to nothing while my entire world collapsed around me. My mom was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. Sarah was still holding my arm, probably the only thing keeping me upright at that point. Aunt Linda was the first to move, rushing over to comfort my mom while shooting apologetic looks in my direction. But I couldn't process comfort right then. I couldn't process anything except the bombshell that had just exploded in my face. I had a biological father. He'd been sending money for my education. And according to Robert, he was sitting outside our house right now. I walked to the front window on shaky legs and peered through the curtains. There, parked across the street in a navy blue sedan, was a man I'd never seen before. He was maybe in his early 40s with dark hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably familiar when I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the side mirror. He'd been waiting outside during my entire birthday party. While I was announcing my college acceptance, while Robert was destroying my sense of family and identity, this stranger, my father, had been sitting in his car, probably working up the courage to knock on our door. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just some random revelation. This had been planned. My mom knew he was coming. She'd been nervous all week because she knew this moment was inevitable. I turned back to face the room where my birthday party had turned into a family intervention I never saw coming. Everyone was looking at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, waiting to see how I'd react to having my entire life turned upside down in the span of 10 minutes. But you know what? I wasn't going to break down. Not in front of everyone. Not on my 18th birthday. Instead, I was going to get answers. I was going to find out exactly what had been hidden from me for 18 years, and I was going to meet the man who was apparently my real father. Because if there's one thing I inherited from whichever parent it was, determination. The next few minutes felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. My guests started filtering out, mumbling awkward goodbyes and promising to call later. Sarah squeezed my hand and whispered that she'd stay if I needed her, but I told her I needed to handle this alone. Deep down, I knew this conversation with my mom was going to be brutal, and I didn't want witnesses for what was coming. Once everyone was gone, I sat down across from my mom at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd had countless heart-to-hearts over the years. But this time felt different. This time I wasn't the naive daughter seeking advice. I was an 18-year-old woman demanding the truth. "How long have you been in contact with him?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. My mom wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "His name is David Matthews. We've been corresponding for about 3 years now." 3 years, I felt my composure crack slightly. "You've been talking to my biological father for 3 years and you never thought to mention it. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "David reached out when you turned 15. He'd been respecting our decision to keep him away, but when you got older he wanted to contribute to your future. That's when he started sending money for your college fund." I leaned back in my chair trying to process this information. "So the Stanford scholarship isn't the only money I have for college," she shook her head. "David has been putting aside money for you since you were born. When he found out about Stanford, he wanted to make sure you could go without financial stress. The fund he's created, Madison, it's enough to cover all 4 years, plus graduate school if you want it." The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd just called me another man's mistake and stormed out rather than help pay for my education, he wasn't even my real father. Meanwhile, my actual father had been quietly ensuring my future was secure, even though he'd never been allowed to be part of my life. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did he come today?" My mom's face crumpled again. "Because I told him about your birthday party. I told him about Stanford. And I told him that Robert was becoming more and more resentful. David said he couldn't stand by anymore, knowing his daughter was growing up in a house where she wasn't truly wanted." That stung, but it also sparked something inside me, a cold, calculating anger that I'd never felt before. Robert had spent years making me feel like I should be grateful for his sacrifice in raising me. He'd used his role as my father figure to make me feel guilty whenever I asked for anything, always reminding me how much everything cost, how much he was doing for me out of the goodness of his heart. But it had all been a lie. He'd been playing the martyr while my real father quietly supported me from the shadows. I want to meet him, I said firmly. My mom nodded like she'd been expecting this. He's still outside. He said he'd wait as long as it took. I stood up and walked to the front door, my heart pounding but my mind crystal clear. When I opened it and stepped onto our front porch, the man in the navy sedan immediately got out of his car. Up close, the family resemblance was unmistakable. We had the same nose, the same stubborn jawline, the same dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Madison, he said, his voice tentative but warm. I'm David. I'm your father. For a moment we just stood there looking at each other. Then, without really thinking about it, I walked down the front steps and crossed the street to where he was standing. You've been sending money for my college, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He was trying hard to hold back. I know I don't have the right to be part of your life. I know I gave up that privilege 18 years ago. But I couldn't let you struggle financially when I had the means to help. Why didn't you fight for custody? Why didn't you try to be part of my life? David's expression grew pained. Your mother was married. Robert was willing to raise you as his own. I was young, scared, and I thought you'd be better off in a stable two-parent home than with a single father who barely had his life together. I thought I was doing the right thing by stepping aside. I studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or selfishness. But all I saw was genuine regret and a desperate hope that maybe somehow we could build some kind of relationship now. Tell me about the money, I said. He smiled slightly, and I could see he was relieved that I was asking practical questions instead of screaming at him or telling him to leave. I started putting money aside the day you were born. $500 a month for the first 10 years, then $1,000 a month after that. When I got promoted to senior engineer at my company, I increased it to $1,500, plus interest and some smart investments. Madison, you have over $400,000 waiting for you. My knees nearly buckled. $400,000. More than enough for Stanford graduate school, maybe even a house down payment when I was ready for that. All from a man I'd never met who owed me nothing legally but had chosen to provide for me anyway. There's more, he continued, seeming to read my thoughts. I've been following your achievements from a distance. Your mother sends me your report cards, your awards, pictures from school events. I have a whole photo album of your life, Madison. I know you made honor roll every semester, that you're class treasurer, that you volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends. This revelation hit differently than everything else. While Robert had been grudgingly attending my school events and making me feel guilty for every achievement, David had been celebrating them from afar, proud of a daughter he'd never been allowed to claim. I have something for you, he said, walking back to his car. He returned with a wrapped box, clearly a birthday present. I know this is all overwhelming and I don't expect anything from you, but I've been buying you a birthday present every year for 18 years, hoping that someday I'd get the chance to give them to you. I took the box with trembling hands. Inside was a beautiful necklace with a pendant that had my birthstone surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was elegant, expensive, and clearly chosen with care and love. But more than that, it represented something I'd never had before, a parent who chose to love me without resentment, without keeping score of what it cost them, without making me feel like I owed them something for their care. Standing there on my 18th birthday, holding a gift from the father I'd never known, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be a victim of this family drama anymore. I was going to take control of my own story. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into getting to know David while simultaneously planning what I now think of as my strategic response to Robert's 18 years of emotional manipulation. See, the more time I spent with my real father, the more I realized how toxic my home environment had actually been. David and I started meeting for coffee every few days. Unlike Robert, who had always made me feel like I was interrupting his life whenever I wanted to talk, David was genuinely interested in everything about me. He asked about my dreams, my fears, my plans for college. He wanted to know about my friends, my hobbies, even my favorite foods. It was like he was trying to make up for 18 years of missed conversations all at once. During one of these coffee dates, I learned something that made my blood boil. David told me that he'd actually tried to reach out several times over the years, especially when I was younger. He'd sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, but they'd all been returned unopened. Robert had been intercepting everything and sending it back without ever telling me or my mom. I stopped trying when you were about 10, David explained, stirring his coffee absently. I figured you were better off not knowing about me if your family was stable and happy. But I never stopped caring and I never stopped providing for you financially. That night I confronted my mom about the returned letters and presents. She broke down completely, admitting that Robert had threatened to leave if she allowed any contact with David. She'd been terrified of being a single mother with no job skills, so she'd gone along with his demands. I was young and scared, Madison, she sobbed. I thought I was protecting our family. But here's the thing that really got to me. She admitted that Robert had been using my paternity against her in every argument they'd ever had. Anytime she wanted something for me, dance lessons, summer camp, a new laptop for school, he'd bring up how it wasn't his responsibility to pay for another man's child. My mom had been walking on eggshells for 18 years, and I'd been the weapon he used to keep her in line. That's when I decided it was time to turn the tables. I started documenting everything. Every snide comment Robert made when he bothered to come home, every time he complained about money while sitting in his brand new truck, every instance of him treating me like I was costing him something just by existing. I kept a detailed journal of his behavior, complete with dates and times. But more importantly, I started building a support network. Sarah, my best friend, was absolutely furious when I told her everything. Her parents, who'd always been like a second family to me, were horrified by Robert's behavior and immediately offered to help in any way they could. Then there was my Aunt Linda, my mom's sister, who turned out to be a secret weapon I hadn't expected. She pulled me aside one afternoon and revealed that she'd never liked Robert, had always thought he treated me differently than he should have, but hadn't felt it was her place to interfere. "I've been waiting 18 years for your mother to stand up to that man," she told me bluntly. "He's been emotionally abusing both of you, and frankly, I'm proud of you for finally calling him out on it." Aunt Linda worked as a paralegal at a family law firm, and she gave me some interesting information about my legal rights now that I was 18. Since Robert had never legally adopted me, he had absolutely no claim to any decision-making in my life. More importantly, since David was my biological father and was willing to claim paternity, he could legally provide for my education and future without Robert having any say in the matter. But the most satisfying part of my strategic planning came when I discovered Robert's hypocrisy in the most ironic way possible. Remember how he'd stormed out on my birthday ranting about not wanting to pay for another man's child to go to college? Well, it turns out he'd already been telling his coworkers and friends that he was paying for my Stanford education. Sarah's mom worked at the same company as Robert, and she overheard him bragging to some colleagues about how expensive my education was going to be, but how proud he was to sacrifice everything for his daughter's future. He was literally using my success to make himself look like Father of the Year, while simultaneously telling me I didn't deserve his support. That's when I knew exactly how to handle this situation. I spent hours planning my approach, discussing strategy with David, who turned out to have a deliciously sharp mind for justice. He'd been successful in business partly because he understood how to play the long game, and he was more than willing to help me teach Robert a lesson about consequences. "You know what I think we should do," David said during one of our planning sessions. "I think we should let him keep telling everyone what a wonderful sacrificing father he is. Let him dig that hole as deep as possible." The plan we came up with was beautifully simple. Robert loved being seen as the martyr, the long-suffering stepfather, who was heroically putting another man's child through college. So we were going to let him have that narrative for exactly as long as it took to make it as public and embarrassing as possible when the truth came out. I started strategically mentioning in conversations with family friends how grateful I was that Robert was paying for Stanford, how he'd told me he'd handle all the expenses, how proud I was to have such a generous father figure. Word spread quickly through our community about what a stand-up guy Robert was being. Meanwhile, David and I were setting up the college fund transfer, making sure all the legal paperwork was in order, and planning for my departure to Stanford in the fall. We also started building a real father-daughter relationship, which honestly was the best part of this entire situation. David took me to dinner at nice restaurants, not because he was trying to buy my affection, but because he genuinely wanted to spend time with me. He introduced me to his parents, my grandparents, who cried when they met me, and immediately started planning family gatherings to make up for lost time. They were kind, warm people who welcomed me with open arms and made me realize what I'd been missing by not having them in my life. But the most important alliance I formed during this time was with my mom. Once she started seeing Robert's behavior through my eyes, and once she realized that David was a stable, successful man who genuinely wanted to be part of our lives, she began to find her backbone again. "I've been so afraid of being alone," she admitted to me one evening. "But watching you handle all of this with such grace and strength, I realize I raised a daughter who's braver than I ever was. Maybe it's time I learned from you." By the end of May, about 6 weeks after my birthday disaster, I had everything in place for what I was privately calling Operation Reality Check. Robert was still living in our house, still making snide comments about my college plans, still playing the martyr whenever anyone would listen. He had no idea that his entire world was about to come crashing down. The best part, he'd actually started being nicer to me in public, probably because he was getting so much positive attention for being such a generous father figure. He was basking in the praise from neighbors and coworkers, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd soon have to explain why another man was paying for everything he was taking credit for. I was 18 years old, about to graduate high school, and I was orchestrating a takedown that would expose 18 years of emotional manipulation and hypocrisy. And honestly, I'd never felt more powerful in my entire life. Graduation day arrived like the perfect stage for my carefully orchestrated finale. Robert had been telling everyone for weeks that he was throwing me a big graduation party to celebrate before I left for Stanford. He'd invited his coworkers, our neighbors, extended family members, basically everyone who'd been listening to his sob story about being such a generous stepfather. What he didn't know was that David and I had been planning our own surprise for this party. The morning of graduation, I sat Robert down for what he thought was going to be a heartfelt thank you conversation. "I just want you to know how grateful I am." I began watching his chest puff up with pride. "I know paying for Stanford is a huge sacrifice, and I want everyone at the party tonight to know what an amazing father you've been." He actually smiled, genuinely smiled for the first time in months. "You deserve the best education, Madison. That's what fathers do for their daughters." I almost felt bad for what was about to happen. Almost. The graduation ceremony itself was bittersweet. Sitting there in my cap and gown, I looked out at the audience and saw my fractured family scattered across the bleachers. Robert was in the front row with my mom, taking pictures and waving like the proud father. But 3 rows back, I spotted David sitting quietly, with my newfound grandparents, beaming with pride that he had every right to feel, but had never been allowed to express. After the ceremony, David approached me carefully, respectfully, keeping his distance from Robert and my mom. "Congratulations, sweetheart," he said, using the endearment that felt natural coming from him. "I'm so incredibly proud of you." Robert's face darkened when he overheard, but with all the other families around, he couldn't make a scene. He just grabbed my arm possessively and steered me toward our car. "Come on, Madison. We have a party to get ready for." The party that evening started exactly as Robert had planned. Our backyard was decorated with balloons and a banner congratulating me on Stanford. Tables were loaded with food, and neighbors were mingling with Robert's coworkers, all eager to congratulate the generous stepfather who was sending his daughter to one of the best universities in the country. I played my part perfectly for the first hour. I thanked Robert publicly for his support, talked about how excited I was for college, and graciously accepted congratulations from everyone who came up to me. Robert was in his element, soaking up praise and playing the role of devoted father to the hilt. Then, right as Robert was preparing to give his big speech about sacrifice and fatherhood, David arrived. I had texted him the exact timing, and his entrance couldn't have been more perfect. He walked into our backyard quietly, dressed in a nice suit, carrying an envelope and a small gift bag. The conversations gradually died down as people noticed the stranger, and Robert's face went white when he spotted him. "Madison," David said clearly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard, "I wanted to give you your graduation present in person." Robert started to move toward us, probably planning to throw David out, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Everyone," I announced, my voice projecting confidence I'd been building for weeks. "I'd like you to meet someone very important. This is David Matthews. He's my biological father." You could have heard a pin drop. Robert's coworkers stopped mid-conversation. Our neighbors turned to stare. Even the catering staff paused what they were doing. David stepped forward, and I could see he was nervous but determined. "I know this is unexpected," he said, addressing the crowd, "but I wanted to personally thank Robert for being such a wonderful father figure to Madison while I wasn't able to be part of her life." The irony was beautiful. David was being gracious and respectful while Robert stood there looking like he'd seen a ghost. "I also wanted to make sure Madison had everything she needed for Stanford," David continued, pulling out the envelope. "So I've taken care of her full tuition, room and board, and expenses for all 4 years." The murmurs that rippled through the crowd were delicious. I watched Robert's face cycle through confusion, anger, and dawning horror as he realized what was happening. "But Robert was paying for Stanford," said Mrs. Henderson from next door, the same woman Robert had been bragging to for weeks. "He told us all about the financial sacrifice he was making." That's when I stepped forward, delivering the line I'd been practicing. "Actually, Robert made it very clear on my 18th birthday that he wouldn't be contributing to my education. He said, and I quote, that he wasn't going to pay for another man's mistake to go to college." The gasps were audible now. Robert's boss, who had been praising him just minutes earlier for being such a dedicated family man, looked absolutely stunned. The neighbors who had been telling their own kids to be grateful like Madison were staring at Robert with obvious confusion and growing disapproval. "Madison, stop," Robert said, his voice tight with panic. "You're taking that out of context." "Am I?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "Because I recorded most of our conversation that day." "Would you like me to play it for everyone? I didn't actually have a recording that would have been illegal in our state without his consent." But the threat was enough to make Robert's face go completely gray. David handed me the envelope and I opened it in front of everyone. Inside were the financial documents showing the college fund he'd been building for 18 years, along with a letter explaining how he'd been quietly supporting me from a distance because he wanted what was best for his daughter. "David has been putting money aside for my education since the day I was born," I announced to the crowd. "He's also been trying to send me birthday cards and Christmas presents for years, but they were always returned unopened." I looked directly at Robert as I delivered the final blow. "So, while Robert has been telling everyone what a generous sacrifice he's making for my education, my real father has been the one actually providing for my future. The same real father that Robert has spent 18 years teaching me to feel guilty about existing." The party atmosphere had completely evaporated. Robert's coworkers were looking at him with obvious disgust. Our neighbors were whispering among themselves, clearly reassessing everything they thought they knew about our family situation. Robert tried to salvage the situation, stammering something about how complicated the whole thing was, how he'd tried his best, how I was being ungrateful, but nobody was buying it anymore. The narrative he'd carefully constructed over 18 years was crumbling in real time, and everyone could see him for what he really was. David put his arm around my shoulders, the first time my father had ever been able to do that at a public event, and smiled at the crowd. "I just want everyone to know how proud I am of Madison. She's accomplished all of this through her own hard work and determination, and I'm honored to finally be able to support her dreams." The contrast couldn't have been starker. David was dignified, genuine, and clearly proud of his daughter. Robert looked like a fraud who'd been caught red-handed, which is exactly what he was. The party ended awkwardly, with guests making excuses to leave early and avoiding eye contact with Robert. I watched him standing alone by the dessert table, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen him. For just a moment I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered 18 years of feeling like I owed him something for tolerating my existence, and the sympathy evaporated. My mom spent the evening apologizing to David for keeping him away for so long and to me for allowing Robert's behavior to go unchecked. David was gracious about everything, more focused on building our future relationship than rehashing past wrongs. "We can't change the past," he told her gently, "but we can make sure Madison knows she's loved and supported going forward." The next few days were a whirlwind of consequences that honestly exceeded even my expectations. Robert's boss called him on Monday morning to discuss concerns about his character and judgment after hearing the full story from multiple coworkers who'd attended the party. Apparently, Robert had been presenting himself as a devoted family man at work, using his sacrifice for my education as evidence of his strong moral character. Finding out it was all a lie didn't reflect well on his trustworthiness in other areas. Our neighbors, who had held Robert up as an example of step-parenting done right, were now looking at our family completely differently. Mrs. Henderson, who had been praising Robert's generosity for weeks, actually came over to apologize to me for not recognizing what was happening sooner. "I feel terrible," she said, tears in her eyes. "You've been living next door to us your whole life, and I never realized you were being treated differently in your own home." But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Remember how I mentioned that Aunt Linda worked as a paralegal? Well, she'd been doing some research into the financial aspects of our situation, and she discovered something that made Robert's hypocrisy even worse. It turns out that for the past several years, Robert had been claiming me as a dependent on his tax returns to get the child tax credit money he'd been pocketing while complaining about the cost of raising me. He'd also been receiving Social Security survivor benefits that were meant for me after my maternal grandfather died, benefits I'd never even known existed. "He's been profiting off your existence while making you feel guilty about it," Aunt Linda explained. "That's not just emotionally abusive, it's potentially fraud." Armed with this information, David's lawyer sent Robert a letter demanding an accounting of all the benefits he'd received on my behalf over the years. The total amount was staggering, almost $30,000 that should have been set aside for my future or used directly for my expenses, but instead had been absorbed into Robert's general household budget. Robert's response was to pack his bags and move out of our house entirely. He left a note saying he was done dealing with an ungrateful family and that my mom and I could figure out our own lives without him. Honestly, it felt like Christmas morning. The house was instantly more peaceful without Robert's constant negativity and resentment hanging over everything. My mom started smiling again, really smiling, not the forced cheerfulness she'd been faking for years. She began talking about going back to school herself, maybe getting the nursing degree she'd given up when she married Robert. "I forgot what it felt like to live without constantly worrying about setting someone off," she told me one morning over coffee. "I didn't realize how much energy I was spending just trying to keep the peace." David stepped up in ways I hadn't expected. He didn't try to replace Robert or act like we could instantly become a normal father-daughter pair after 18 years apart. Instead, he focused on being consistently present and supportive. He took me apartment hunting near Stanford's campus, helped me set up a bank account for my college expenses, and introduced me to family members I'd never known existed. Meeting David's side of the family was like discovering a missing piece of myself I hadn't known was gone. His parents, my grandparents, were warm intellectual people who shared my love of reading and learning. His sister, my aunt, was a successful engineer who immediately started mentoring me about succeeding in male-dominated fields. They welcomed me with open arms, never making me feel like an outsider or treating our reunion as awkward. "We've been waiting to meet you for 18 years, my grandmother said, hugging me tightly during our first family dinner together. "We have so much lost time to make up for." The contrast with Robert's family was stark. They had always treated me politely but distantly, and I now understood why. They'd probably known the truth about my paternity from the beginning and had been following Robert's lead in treating me like an outsider. But perhaps the most unexpected development was watching my mom transform into someone I barely recognized. Without Robert's constant criticism and control, she started rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried for years. She enrolled in online classes to finish her bachelor's degree. She reconnected with old friends Robert had discouraged her from seeing. She even started dating David again, slowly and carefully, but with genuine affection that had apparently survived 18 years of separation. "We were kids when we first met," she explained to me one evening. "We made mistakes, but we never stopped caring about each other. And we both always cared about you even when we couldn't be together." 3 weeks after the graduation party disaster, we got word through mutual friends that Robert had moved to another state and was telling people there that his ungrateful stepdaughter had chosen her deadbeat biological father over the man who had sacrificed everything to raise her. He was still playing the victim, still refusing to take responsibility for his behavior, but his version of events wasn't getting the sympathetic audience he expected. Word had spread through our community about what really happened, and anyone who cared to look into it could see the truth. Robert had burned his bridges so thoroughly that even his own family members were distancing themselves from him. Meanwhile, David and I were building something genuine and beautiful. He never tried to buy my affection or make up for lost time through expensive gifts. Instead, he invested in getting to know me as a person. He came to my final high school events, met my friends, learned about my interests and dreams. He treated me like a daughter he was proud to claim, not a burden he was grudgingly tolerating. The best part was watching him and my mom fall in love all over again. They were taking it slow, both of them, older and wiser now, but there was something beautiful about seeing two people get a second chance at happiness after 18 years of making the best of bad decisions. As I prepared to leave for Stanford in the fall, I realized that Robert's cruelty on my 18th birthday had actually been the best gift he could have given me. His mask had finally slipped completely, forcing everyone to see the truth about our family dynamics and giving David the opening he'd been waiting for to become part of my life. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the most beautiful transformations. Now, 6 months later, I'm sitting in my dorm room at Stanford, looking back on what has been the most transformative year of my life. What started as the worst birthday of my existence turned into the catalyst for building the family I'd always deserved but never knew was possible. David and my mom got married again 3 months ago, a small, beautiful ceremony that felt like a celebration of second chances and found family. Watching them exchange vows, knowing they'd found their way back to each other despite 18 years of separation and pain, was honestly more emotional than any movie I've ever seen. They're both different people now, wiser, more grateful, more committed to building something real together. The best part is that their relationship doesn't feel rushed or forced. They spent months in counseling, working through the pain and mistakes of the past, figuring out how to be partners and co-parents in this new chapter of their lives. They're taking nothing for granted this time around. Stanford has been everything I dreamed it would be, and more. Having the financial security that David provided has allowed me to focus on my studies and explore opportunities I never could have considered before. I'm majoring in engineering, inspired partly by my newfound aunt, who's become an incredible mentor and role model. But more than the academic opportunities, having David as a real father has changed how I see myself in the world. For 18 years, I carried this underlying anxiety about being a burden, about owing someone something just for existing. Now I understand what it feels like to be unconditionally loved and supported. David is proud of my achievements, not because they reflect well on him, but because he genuinely wants me to succeed and be happy. We talk on the phone twice a week and he visits campus once a month. He's not trying to make up for 18 years of missed parenting by being overbearing. Instead, he's focused on being the father I need now as an adult building her own life. The financial revelations about Robert keep getting worse, by the way. Aunt Linda's investigation uncovered even more instances of him profiting from my existence while claiming I was a financial burden. The tax fraud alone was enough to trigger an IRS audit that resulted in hefty penalties and interest charges. Last I heard, he was working an entry-level job and living in a studio apartment, finally experiencing the financial consequences of his choices. But honestly, I rarely think about Robert anymore. He was a chapter in my life that's definitively closed. I've learned that holding on to anger about the past just gives toxic people continued power over your present. The best revenge has been building a beautiful life surrounded by people who actually love and support me. My relationship with my mom has grown stronger too. She's like a different person now, confident, pursuing her own dreams, no longer walking on eggshells or making herself small to keep peace with an unreasonable man. She's finishing her nursing degree and talking about specializing in family counseling, partly inspired by our own journey of healing and reconciliation. I want to help other families who are struggling with similar situations, she told me last month. I spent so many years thinking I was protecting you by staying quiet about Robert's behavior, but I realize now that I was just enabling his emotional abuse. Maybe I can help other mothers find their voice sooner than I found mine. The extended family situation has been interesting to navigate. David's family has embraced me completely, treating me like I've always been part of their lives. His parents send care packages to my dorm, his sister calls to check on my classes, and I'm included in all family holidays and celebrations. Robert's family, on the other hand, has largely disappeared from our lives. A few of them reached out with awkward apologies, admitting they'd known about his resentment toward me but hadn't felt it was their place to intervene. I appreciate their honesty, but I've realized I don't need people in my life who could watch a child be emotionally mistreated and choose to stay silent. The most surprising development has been how this experience has shaped my career goals. I'm still pursuing engineering, but I've also become passionate about family advocacy and helping young people navigate complex family situations. I volunteer with a campus organization that supports first-generation college students and students from dysfunctional family backgrounds. Sharing my story with other young people who faced similar challenges has been incredibly healing. So many students carry shame about their family situations, feeling like they have to hide dysfunction or pretend their families are more supportive than they actually are. Being able to say, "I understand and it's not your fault and you deserve better," has become one of the most meaningful parts of my college experience. I've also learned that family is something you build, not just something you're born into. The people who truly love you will show up consistently, support your dreams, and make you feel valued for who you are. Blood relations who treat you poorly don't deserve loyalty just because you share DNA. David has taught me what real parental love looks like: celebrating your successes without taking credit, supporting your dreams, even when they're expensive or inconvenient, and making you feel like your existence is a gift to the world, rather than a burden to be tolerated. Looking back, I can see that Robert's cruelty on my 18th birthday was actually the push I needed to demand better for myself. His mask slipping completely forced everyone, including my mom, to finally see the truth about our family dynamics. Sometimes the worst moments in life are actually doorways to better chapters we never could have imagined. I'm 20 now, thriving at one of the best universities in the country, surrounded by people who genuinely love and support me, and building toward a future that feels limitless rather than constrained by someone else's resentment and limitations. The scared, guilt-ridden girl who felt grateful for scraps of conditional acceptance is gone. In her place is a young woman who knows her worth and won't settle for anything less than authentic love and respect. So, here's my question for all of you who've made it through this wild family drama with me. Have you ever had to choose between the family you were born into and the family you deserved? Have you experienced that moment when someone's mask finally slips and you see them clearly for the first time? Drop a comment below and share your own stories of family karma, standing up for yourself, or finding the courage to demand better. Your experiences might help someone else who's struggling with similar situations. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama and justice-served moments. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they deserve unconditional love and support, not conditional acceptance based on someone else's convenience. Thank you for joining me on this journey from family betrayal to chosen family triumph. Remember, you get to decide who deserves a place in your life, and blood relation doesn't automatically equal loyalty. Choose people who choose you back, and never settle for being treated like you're someone's burden instead of their blessing. Until next time, keep standing up for yourselves and demanding the love and respect you deserve.